I'm Russ Howison. I'm a recreation planner and cultural resource specialist for PacifiCorp Energy, and I'm going to be talking about the Condit Hydroelectric Project. Just sort of a quick overview. I have a lot of photos, so I'm going to try to let the photos pretty much tell the story, but I'm going to give a little background on PacifiCorp Energy and who we are, talk a little bit about the timeline and process for the Condit decommissioning, and then look at our pre-beach activity and our post-breach activity. So, PacifiCorp Energy, we are a large electric utility with about, I think we're upwards 2 million customers. And our service territory is in Utah, Wyoming, Idaho. We do business there as Rocky Mountain Power, and Washington, Oregon, and California as Pacific Power. Hydro is only about 10% of our total generation portfolio, but as what the company considers a renewable resource, it is very important to our hydro generation. The Condit project is located in White Salmon, Washington, on the White Salmon River. It's about 45 miles east of Portland. It's 3 miles upstream of the Columbia River. The dam was 3 miles upstream. It was the only man-made impoundment between Mount Adams and the Columbia River, and there's only one dam on the Columbia between the White Salmon and the ocean. Project location, you can see, where's the, now what? Center button. Oh, there we go. Oh, there we go. Okay. So here's the Columbia here, and this is the mouth of the White Salmon down here. Columbia Pool, or Bonneville Pool rather, from Bonneville Dam. So flat water down in here goes to Riverine, and this is the project area. So this is our bypass reach, powerhouse down here, and dam right there, obviously. The reservoir was about 2 miles long. From the map, you could see it was kind of a long, skinny reservoir. 92 acres total, fed by the south side of Mount Adams, which is glacier fed. And the most important thing about the reservoir to remember is there were 2.5 million cubic yards of sediment trapped behind the reservoir. The dam was, I guess you would say, a moderate-sized dam compared to some of the enormous dams we have in the Southwest, but it was 125 feet tall and 470 feet long. And the important thing to remember about the dam is it contained 29,000 cubic yards of concrete. So the project had a water conveyance system, which was essentially this large wood pipe that you see on your left that fed into a surge tank. The surge tank then divided into 2 pipes called Penstocks that fed the powerhouse. And the most important thing about the water conveyance system is it was about 1 mile long. So there was essentially a road cut along the east side of the White Salmon Canyon that the flow line was built in this road cut. So the powerhouse was about 14 megawatts, and that's about 77,000 megawatt hours of energy per year, which is roughly enough energy to power about 7,000 homes. So not a huge project, but moderate size, modest, we would say. As most of you probably know, any non-federal hydropower project requires a license from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and we have to renew those licenses periodically. And so for Condit was actually built in 1913. It went for many years without a license. For some reason, I'm not exactly sure why, the company had to get a license in the 60s. It was a 30-year license, so that license came due in the early 90s. And FERC, as we call them, must go through the NEPA process to issue a new license. So therefore, the company had to prepare a license application with detailed information on power, the need for power, environmental resources, cultural resources, recreation, and the socioeconomics of the project. So for a chronology, a quick chronology, the company began working on the license application and preparing studies in December of '88. The application was filed in December of '91. Fish and Wildlife Service basically placed fish passage conditions under the Federal Power Act. The Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries have the ability to require fish passage at the project. The project had no fish ladders. There were ladders originally constructed with the dam in 1913. They were very elaborate, sort of Rube Goldberg wooden fish ladders, and they washed out almost immediately. I think there was, in the first spring runoff, the fish ladder was completely wiped out. They rebuilt it. It was wiped out again several years later, and they developed a hatchery down on the Columbia to basically mitigate for the loss of habitat above the dam. So we went through an EIS process, and the mandatory conditions that FERC was placing on the project as a result of that EIS were essentially making the project uneconomic for our customers, and we therefore began to discuss what to do about that and entered our settlement negotiations in 1999. So the important thing to remember here is the reason why we reached settlement to remove the project is that it was theoretically going to cost significantly less to remove the project than to build the fish passage facilities. And that was the key point from the company's perspective, trying to protect our customers' interests in providing inexpensive energy. So the details of the agreement called for it to be removed in 2006. The agreement was reached in '99. Everybody knew there was going to be a lot of permitting involved. So initially, we were supposed to remove the project in 2006. We, however, did not get the final permits and the FERC order until late 2011 and early 2012. Some of our parties to the settlement agreement, probably the most important one that I would point out on the upper right is the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission and the Yakama Nation. The project is within ceded lands of the Yakama Nation. They're a very powerful tribe in Washington state. They have a pretty strongly worded treaty, and they retain rights to hunt and fish even on private land within their ceded territory. So certainly there were a lot of NGOs involved, and the main services, federal agencies involved, but it was really largely CRITFIC and the Yakama Nation that were the first ones to really propose removal in a serious way, and they were quickly followed by the agencies. So just a kind of a quick look at chronology. We entered settlement negotiations in '97. We reached agreement in '99. We had to go through a whole NEPA process for the removal, of course. We had to get a biological opinion on removal because there's an endangered salmon in the river. And then in July 2004, we started this long, arduous process of pursuing a 404 and a 401. And that's really what took so long. Why did it take 12 years or more to remove the dam when the agreement was reached in '99? It really had to do with the agencies wondering how in the world they're going to issue 401 and 404 permits under the Clean Water Act. How do you permit a private company to introduce 2.5 million cubic yards of sediment into a river with endangered species? So it was very tricky. Looking at what the removal project calls for, this is an original photo of the dam right before the reservoir was inundated. This is the diversion structure. So the entire flow of the river was diverted through this tunnel under the dam while the dam was constructed in the dry. and then they filled this tunnel with rock and blocked it. Dam is gone. That's the big plan, remove the dam. So how do you remove the dam? We blast a tunnel from the downstream side in the very bottom of the dam right here. These are the sluice gates that were installed to sluice sediment out of the reservoir, which, interestingly enough, those were initially installed with the construction of the dam with the intention of sluicing sediment annually, and they never did it. Not once did they ever open those gates and sluice out sediment, because they were so afraid that there would be a log or some debris that would get stuck in there that they wouldn't be able to close them, and the whole project would become basically a failure. So in order to remove the dam from the downstream side, we coffered it off and began excavating this tunnel. And the dam is about 100 feet thick at the base, and so we basically tunneled in 90 feet with blasting and excavators, just removing mechanically the concrete out of the tunnel. And then on breach day, by dynamite charge, blasted out the last 10 feet and drained the reservoir in one quick instant, basically. So initially, the thinking was that it would take about 6 hours to drain the reservoir, and that the flow would be around 10,000 CFS, which is not really that high of a flow for this river. That was, well within 3 or 5 year flood, I believe. Once the reservoir is drained, the entire flow of the river is going to pass through that tunnel for about 11 months or so, 9 months. We're doing a typical concrete removal, basically breaking it up with jackhammers that are mounted on large excavators and hauling it off in trucks, breaking it up into layers. And then the last bullet, and one of the big issues was finding a place to dispose of the concrete. We'll get back to that. So other facilities to be removed: the whole water conveyance system. Those are the Penstocks on the right on their way down to the powerhouse. The important thing to know about the Flowline removal is this is that road cut I was mentioning earlier, and that wound up being the place where all of the concrete from the project was disposed of. So we buried about 35,000 cubic yards of concrete along this road cut. It wound up being about 3 feet thick, and then covered it with soil and are going to revegetate it. So other facilities to be removed: there was a very elaborate coffer dam and diversion system. So that's all going away. This is the dam site's right here. The dam was built right there. So this is just a historic construction photo of all of this stuff was all just inundated and left. So the company had to remove all this material. This is the powerhouse, the only facility of the project that was to remain. The whole hydro project was National Register eligible. It was very key in electrification of the region. It was actually built by a paper mill company just outside of Portland in Washougal, Washington. So the only portion of the powerhouse that was to be removed is this Tailrace feature, which had obvious fish habitat issues with it. So we had to work in the wet to essentially remove that. So back to our chronology. In August 2011, we began decommissioning efforts. By October 2011, we ceased generation. So we did generate all the way up until breach day, just about 45 minutes or so before the breach. They shut the powerhouse off for the last time. By January 2012, we were beginning demolition of the dam. By February 2012, we began grading in the former reservoir to try to get rid of all of that sediment that was behind the dam. By April 2012, that coffer dam we talked about was completely removed. By August 2012, we saw anadromous fish moving upstream. There were steelhead above the dam site, so they literally swam up the tunnel that summer after the breach. And then by September, we had the dam completely removed and began the process of revegetating, which we are still currently working on. And then in the future, we're going to be doing some ongoing environmental monitoring. So one of the conditions of our 401 application is that we monitor the situation, sediment in the river, for the next 10 years. So really quickly, the first step was drawing the reservoir down to minimum pool. We installed a fish weir below the dam. This is prior to the breach, trapping salmonids, releasing them upstream so that they could spawn above the dam site, knowing that the spawning beds below the dam site would all be obliterated by the breach. We then did a fish salvage. This is immediately below the dam. We maintained a minimum in-stream flow by tapping the penstock right there. So that water is coming directly out of the penstock. We're still generating at this point. Then we began the process of tunneling on the downstream side of the dam in the dry. Here's a couple of looks inside the tunnel. The sediment issue. So the picture on the left indicates the sediment level up against the dam. Clearly, a lot of sediment needed to be moved out, and we had to dredge out the sediment on the upstream side down to the base because the hole's going to be here. So this dredging operation went on for about 3 months to basically remove all the sediment to create that bathtub drain. For river access, the major issue that came up was this is a bridge over the upper portion of the reservoir, and this is the only real recreation facility on the reservoir. This boat ramp right here is where all the commercial outfitters taking out from running the commercial raft trips on the upper White Salmon take out here. The White Salmon has what's called the highest commercially run waterfall in the country. And if you run that waterfall commercially, the only place to take out below that waterfall is at this boat ramp. Well, the bridge was engineered to be sitting on a reservoir, not on an active river channel. So we had to completely rebuild these two pylons and constructed this pier all the way across the channel. So there was no way in the world for rafts to pass through here. And what we wound up doing was the cabin owner, there's a cabin right in this area, was nice enough to allow us to basically take over his property. So rafts would take out right above this boat barrier and walk up this scaffolding that we built, and we built a hot loading zone and turnaround in his backyard. October 26, 2011 was breach day. There's some excellent videos online of the breach event. Everybody who was present for the breach, there was a large number of stakeholders gathered. We were all in a house up around the corner. There was not a human being who actually saw the breach occur. This was an unmanned camera that took all the footage. Even the blasting team was up here, really out of sight of the dam. There was a lot of safety concerns around the whole breach event. Quick look at the reservoir before the breach, and the same picture. This is just within 2 hours after the breach. The reservoir drained much quicker than anybody ever expected. And this is that Coffer Dam coming back out of the mud. There were a lot of public safety concerns. Obviously, this whole project was a huge interest to the public. There were all these slopes are very unstable, waterlogged, fine sediments. There was our old boat barrier became this broken cable in the river. We've got this old Coffer Dam. Here's a picture of the Coffer Dam several months later. Clearly a boating hazard. So we had to really do a lot of due diligence to maintain public safety and keep the area clear. We did remove the Coffer Dam, which was a very elaborate operation in of itself. They had to construct a road down this drainage and literally just broke it up with 2 excavators and pulled it out. Another issue was, this is back at the bridge on the upstream side of the reservoir. So you can see how much down cutting has occurred. This is probably about 4 months after the breach. The sediment level was right up around there at this dark line here, right below the rust stain. And there are all these old bridge structures that were in the upper river. Some of them even Native American bridges, and we had to remove all that material as well. The next issue was the grading of all the sediments that were deposited. So we developed a grading plan, and all of the area in blue, this is one of, I think, 4 different map sheets, engineering drawings of the reservoir, and all of these blue shaded areas are graded mechanically and excavated. So once again, 2.5 million cubic yards of sediment. What do you do with it? You go out with an excavator and you just push it all into the river. So the next slide, take a note of this rock band. This is the same rock band. So this is that same landform about 4 months later. So we completely had to recontour these areas with excavators. So here's sort of a look at some of the work we had to do to reestablish side channels. And then once again, just recontouring the entire area. The green is a tackifier because we had a lot of dust problems, and we had to try to abate the dust problems because there's cabin owners right around the former reservoir during the entire time, their summer homes. So looking at the flowline demolition, this is that road cut I spoke about. And finally, the dam demolition, which was a very long and drawn-out process of just slowly but surely chipping away at the dam. This was by last summer, we had it down to this level. And then finally, by late summer, we had it down to just this concrete plug in the very last little nook. And then the final excavation was done with this long arm excavator. We actually had 2 excavators down in the river at one point, pulling out concrete debris. And then finally, with this long arm excavator and this cable yarder, it's a logging equipment, and there was a bucket that would hang from that yellow piece of steel that they would move concrete debris into that and then haul it out. So this is an upstream look at the dam site. Here's the diversion tunnel. Here's where the diversion tunnel was filled in, and the dam is clearly gone. So this is a downstream view of the dam site. I actually took this photo on my cell phone in October of last year. For recreation, once again, we had this major takeout. So this is the boat ramp that outfitters used to take out. This is about 20 feet of downcutting that the river has done since the breach. And we had to do this whole bridge project where we redid these piers. Then immediately after the breach, this concrete retaining wall wasn't there. That was all just an earthen bank. And that started to go with all of the downcutting. The engineers knew there was going to be downcutting in this area, but nobody really knew how much or how serious it was going to be. So we had to do the engineering and do this soil nail wall project, it's called. And as part of that, we conveniently engineered ourselves a little eddy, and this is the new takeout. So we just kept the concrete pad from the old takeout and did this road cut down into this eddy, and that's our new takeout. And we're just really hopeful that the sediment isn't going to just take it away from us in the next few years. Down at the mouth of the reservoir, this is a Native American in-lieu fishing site. Prior to the breach, this was all just water and part of Bonneville Pool. Where did the 2.5 million cubic yards of sediment wind up? Right here at this delta. And it's interesting in that all of the other major tributaries to the Columbia River in this section, the Hood River, the Klickitat River, Wind River, they all have these deltas except for Condit because they didn't have major dams on them. And so there's actually, from a recreation perspective, there's a whole new kiteboarding opportunity right here on this nice little beach that's formed out there. It has made things very interesting for the in-lieu fishing site because their boat ramp is completely silted in and unusable. Well, this whole thing was done for salmon. So what's happening with the salmon? This is where all the spawning took place in that summer of 2011. After we installed the weir, we took the salmon up above the reservoir, reintroduced them, and all of the red dots are spawning beds. The white here are spawning beds that were lost post-breach from all the downcutting that occurred. But clearly, there's a lot of good fish habitat above the reservoir site. And then here we can see this past spawning season, this past fall, spawning occurring in the former reservoir itself. For revegetation, we've got about 50-some acres to revegetate, and we've planted over 16,000 trees. We did grass plantings last fall. We had a very mild winter with a lot of sun, and that was really good for growing ryegrass, which was great. So you can see the ryegrass starting to reestablish. This is a side channel where we're essentially reconstructing riparian habitat in these side channels. This is another side channel here. This is that same landform we were looking at earlier. We are having some issues with erosion. In this area right here, there's we're losing quite a bit of the contoured bank, and that's something that we're going to have to monitor for the next little while. And we did also engineer some log jam structures along the way, which was slightly controversial. So for future activities, it's largely a monitoring issue. As part of our 401 certification, we have to monitor water quality and turbidity for the next several years, actually for 10 years after the breach. We are hopeful that we might be able to demonstrate that we're meeting our water quality standards for 2 or 3 years over the next 5 years and be able to meet our obligations early and therefore not have to monitor for that full 10 years, but only time will tell. So we're going to be putting a lot of effort into our vegetation, our revegetation. The salmon issues we're largely turning over to Yakama Nation, which is a co-manager of the fishery with the state of Washington, and they're really managing the reestablishment of the fishery. This is all on PacifiCorp property. The entire project is on PacifiCorp property. So PacifiCorp is largely responsible for the terrestrial restoration. And of course, we did have one significant cultural resource site that was exposed by the draining of the reservoir. And there's at least one traditional fishing location right above the dam site in the former reservoir. And we're working with Yakama Nation to potentially look at what's future fishing opportunities there for them. So there's a lot of information on our website about Condit. There's links to various other sites. There's a fellow named Andy Macer who worked with National Geographic. He did a whole time-lapse series on this project that's very interesting. You can get a link to that off our website. And there's a couple of other films that the company produced on the history and the whole restoration project. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.